I think, I suspect we're into endgame to a certain extent here now. Um, but what's interesting, it's a very different endgame. Um, he's done an enormously brilliant job in holding off everything that's happened over in Western Germany on the Western Front. But the cost of that has been that you can't hold everything back in the East. I think what we'd be looking at here is a very different piece, and that's something that's worth commenting on at this point. Is it would be a very different piece.
Yeah, in a huge way that would play out, and I suspect the determination for the Allies to launch attacks. I know we've kind of jokingly mentioned that there's been D-Day version 6 so far. Well, if you were Western Europe about this time, it wouldn't surprise me at all if historically there would have been a D-Day version 7, because actually the powers that be by this time, by start of 1945, are starting to realize actually having a Soviet dominated Central, let alone a Western Europe, is not a desirable thing. And you would start to see almost what becomes a land grab, and that some of the decisions that are made on the battlefield are made specifically with the future in mind. You start to see that ever more really from the start of 1945 onwards.
Someone in chat is asking about how accurate historically is Death of Stalin. Not very is probably the basic example. But I'd say
There
what
are
it.
some great bits in
Oh
it though.
yeah.
The Beria situation is
Oh
definitely
god.
worth a look up.
I,
What an
I, I
awful,
think
awful
I
person
think
he
what
was.
it does very very well is it captures the mood and the personalities without necessarily binding itself too rigidly to the reality of history. So if you wanted to read for all of those characters as how they were, it's actually pretty good. If you wanted to use it as a day by day account of what happened after the death of Stalin, you're doing it wrong. But if you just want to understand their personalities, it's very good. Um,
It's got an element of the, I suppose, for me and you, the Blackadder style of history to it. In that it's not certainly don't want to be trying to take any exams based on that as source material, but actually the main thing is if it gets you interested and
yeah.
engaged in the subject, why not get stuck in?
So I think also, as has been pointed out in chat, this would be a much worse piece for Germany. If the war continues, if this war continues in the way it's continuing now, this would historically be a much worse piece for Germany, wouldn't it?
No doubt, no doubt about that at all. In fact, you could argue there would be a very strong argument that there wouldn't be a recognizable Germany had the Soviets managed to take it hook, line, and sinker, and steal the whole show in Western Europe. Wouldn't surprise me if Germany wasn't a Germany at all.
Oh, so chat's telling me he's just switched to manpower law, which I suspect means actually, and to be fair, he could do one thing he's done very well actually is by avoiding so many of the massive encirclements that happened in real life. He's actually done quite well in conserving his manpower. If we look at the 5.04 million figure he's got here, he's emphasised kind of really stopping the bleed on German forces that happened in real life. And I think, as Chat's pointed out, if we have a look, that has actually allowed him to change some of his kind of production laws. So on war economy, well, we are actually at all adults serve, which is not necessarily a great place to be. Um, it's slightly less than scraping the barrel. So we've actually managed to move back. And historically, this was something that didn't really happen, wasn't it? We've already talked about the Volkssturm coming into being and everything else, but those repeated kind of refusals of Hitler to sanction retreats was just the bleed on German manpower was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean the truth is from February 1945, which is the time period that we're looking at now, you would be very, very hard pressed to find some good news in any form of German government or military life. Everything was going wrong from this point onwards, and the truth is, the writing had been on the wall for almost everybody except Adolf Hitler and maybe a handful of absolute diehards of for over a year now. It was no surprise. Nobody was shocked at the way the war was going to end. And the only real argument is exactly how. And there's a famous phrase that's apparently spoken amongst Berliners in 1945, and it said that the optimistic Berliners would learn English and the pessimists would learn Russian.
Yeah, actually, as Electric Fox is pointing out in the chat as well, not to mention the base reluctance of the Germans to mobilise the economy for a war footing until it was too late. Absolutely, it the one of the premises of Nazism early on, and it even manifests back into the Battle of Britain, is that principle that Hitler has sold to the German people that you will not be affected by this, and that he's bound by that going forward in a way that the Allies aren't, and that has enormous repercussions. It's why when German bombers accidentally bomb London, he switches focus. We bomb Berlin, and he switches focus. It's why he can't mobilise the economy properly until later on. It's why we talked earlier about Speer and Speer's genius as a logistician and as an organiser. But he's enormously hampered. I almost genuinely worry what would have happened if Germany had taken the same approach to a war economy that Britain had, but had Speer in charge rather than some of the people who walked through that job in the UK.
Yeah, and you'd be absolutely right to worry, and it's maybe something that we haven't really touched on so far, and that's reality is what we're playing out a sort of grand strategy on computer at the moment, of course, and it's interesting to show how these lines moved. What we've not really touched on is actually what life was like for these people who found themselves, whether they liked it or not, in this situation. And historically, about this time, what you're starting to find is that the Russians are by now overrunning concentration camps and
Yeah.
the site of former even death camps in Poland. The world is starting to wake up to actually just how horrific the Nazi regime was.
And again, like you say, in reality, that's what's happening. These camps are being overrun at this point. The reality of what's kicking in is there for all to see, and that efficiency that had allowed them to do so much in economic terms had unfortunately been turned to the cause of evil as well. And I think that's really absolutely worth marking. And we can talk about this, and we're looking at this through that window. This is a thing that no game will ever emulate and shouldn't emulate. Is that side of it, because it's just not good. Um, we're seeing actually, by the way, in game that I think, yeah, he's holding down in Romania in a way that he wasn't able to before. Um, it's the situation has stabilised somewhat, but again, this is all stabilisation. It's not advances. That original advance plan to Moscow is looking further and further away from reality.
Yeah, it's yeah, I don't think there's any real danger of Moscow coming under artillery fire by this
That's
time.
a long advance. Something, by the way, that we should mention is someone that most people don't really know about. I mean, there's some good chat going on in chat at the moment about Fritz Todt as Minister of Armaments and everything else. Something that I highly recommend people look into, or a person to look into. I've got a piece coming out about this in about 3 months. Is Julius Dortmüller, who's a name that's not known to many people. I think we drunkenly talked about him once back in Belgium, down on one of the
Yeah,
trips. Who is actually the guy who's in charge of the German railways at this point, and arguably has as big an impact on the war as Speer does. When the Allied intelligence agencies are ranking the impact of people on the war in 1944 and 45, there are two people that they rank as having the same level of impact as a German field marshal, who aren't field marshals. One is Albert Speer and the other is Julius Dortmüller, because they realise that these are the people who are essentially powering the economy while other people are powering the armies. Dortmüller actually dies of cancer in 1945, before kind of the Nuremberg trials happened. But as Dan said earlier, like on the Speer subject, I strongly suspect that Dortmüller might have been one of the other ones who would have suddenly discovered that he knew what was going on and wishes he'd done more about it, and would maybe have been pardoned. And I think that would have been because of his impact on economically on what Germany needed to do and could have done in the peace. But he's a fascinating
absolutely.
character and well worth looking into if you don't know about him. Um, but yeah, I mean, so let's take stock. So Dan, real world terms, we're into February 1945. We're looking at France here. Where was the Allied line on the Western Front in reality by this point?
By February 1945, I mean you're really looking at advances towards the Rhine River, and in particular an Allied assault into an area known as the Reichswald Forest, which leads you really up to the border, not far from the areas that have already been heavily fought over around Nijmegen, leading up to the Rhine River, and we're looking now at really German last-ditch defences to try and throw up some kind of physical barrier which are going to stop advances in the west. It's worth pointing out at this point, really, not that far away from resistance in the West crumbling entirely, and the decision being made with the writing being well and truly on the wall by defensive troops as to whether they'd like to fall into the hands of the Soviets or the Western Allies, and almost universally the answer is going to be they want to fall into the hands of the Western Allies. If I can just point out whilst we're talking, I think we've just rolled through the end of February 1945, and I wanted to give somebody a quick mention just because he's a particularly awful character, and I think deserves it only because he receives a fitting end, and it also ties into a period of the war that we've not touched on too much so far, and that's quite literally the air campaign that is now being waged on German cities, and it really is devastating the infrastructure by this time of the war. We've got massive air raids, 1,000 bomber air raids by both the United States Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force day in and day out. One of those men that is killed in Berlin in February 1945, a month the time we're looking at now, is a guy by the name of Roland Freisler, who's the head of the German People's Court, the chap that you might see on Nazi newsreels of the 1930s and 40s screaming and shouting at Stauffenberg conspirators. And he rather fairly gets his head crushed by a couple of 100 tons of cement, and I think well and truly deserved it. He was one of the truly evil characters of a rather evil regime, as we know.
Yeah, I mean there are not a lot of people I would wish that fate on, but I can genuinely say that he is one of them. I mean, an
Yeah,
attendee of the Wannsee conference. Let's not forget. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, what's interesting here is I wonder whether we're seeing. I've clicked us into the Soviets because one thing I'm wondering whether we might see here, and I'm not seeing it yet, is whether we might not see the Allies switch focus to trying to move through the Soviet fronts as much as anything else. Um, which I know would be a long way to go by train and everywhere else, but that we seem to run out of D-days, um, and that surprises me slightly because you'd think they'd still push. I mean, actually, yeah, no, look, hang on, no, let's zoom out there. There's a Union Jack floating around there in the in the
So there
Soviet
is.
sphere. And there's one floating around down here as well. I think the Allies might be flipping to say, well, the Soviets have made the territory. Um, let's go for this. Um, which is again fascinating because we talked before about Allied equipment, British equipment and American equipment being used there. One of my favourite things, I mean, again, something we've talked about before, is just kind of how much of this is about using the materials and everything else that that, that the Allies can get, and the Soviets are essentially granted everything they ask for. When they turn around to America, to the British, and say, I need stuff, give me stuff, they give them everything. The only thing I've ever found documented history of the Soviets being denied was 4 tons of pitch blende, which, if for anyone who knows a bit of physics and everything else, will know that the Soviets asked for this because they wanted to make an awful lot of luminous tiles. The thing that you can turn pitch blende into, of course, is uranium. It's the only thing I've ever found that the Americans turned around to the Soviets and went, "Yeah, no, you're not having any of that," which actually raises an interesting question. I mean, you have to wonder historically whether this would have changed the question with the Russian forces where they are, with the Soviet forces where they are, the Allies nowhere to be seen, whether it would have changed the question about where the atomic bomb was used.
Very interesting, and there's some interesting, I suppose, again looking into the counterfactual stuff as well. When it comes to the famous Manhattan Project, it's worth mentioning that as the Western Allies come sweeping through Germany, where possible, they start sweeping up German physicists, Nordhausen being captured, the V weapons factory being one example, and scooting them off to the United States. So there are elements where there is direct competition, and then the same breath, there are elements where the Allies and go actually operate very well. For example, shuttle bombing, which is something that's not particularly well known, but it's quite simply where, for example, an RAF bomber might take off in London, might bomb a target in Germany, but then land in Soviet territory. And this did happen from time to time, and showed some fair cooperation between the major allies.
Chat's pointed out to me because obviously kindly chat are keeping an eye on Mordred's team as well, which is the thing we can't do. Something we've missed is, and we were asking about where the D-days have gone. Mordred has apparently focused a considerable amount of his U-boat force on essentially denying the channels to the Allies, which is an incredibly smart tactical move. Incredibly smart tactical move. I mean, you talked earlier about kind of the difficulties the Germans had in prosecuting a successful U-boat war going on. Of course, the advantage Mordred has is he knows that Enigma's been broken, so he can, he doesn't have that problem. He can redo his codes, which he can't even do too much in this version of the game, but he's not dealing with that same problem that the Germans had to do. So that to a certain extent gives us our context on why we've run out of D-days. He's done very well in cutting off that coastline from the Allies.
It obviously seems to be a very very effective method, and you wonder how that would have played out sort of historically if you look at that. I suspect it wouldn't have done because of literally the dominance of Allied air power by this stage in the war, but perhaps it's something that that he's taken on board and thought, it's a way to defend. And of course, it is another method of defense, much like the Atlantic Wall is. If you can defend before people reach your your earth, your dry land, then why not? All the more effective.
Something that someone's mentioned in chat as well about kind of backing you up on the kind of the German scientists and the atomic projects. I lived in the US for a while. I lived in New York. I was lucky enough to live in New York for a couple of years, and I still vividly remember when I first moved there. And one of the little forms I had to fill in when I moved in was a little form that when you entered, you had to tick boxes to say you hadn't done certain things. And one of them on there was a tick box to say, "I confirm I have never committed genocide." And I always felt, and the historian of me will wondered is did Werner von Braun and those other guys, did they face that same form, and did they have to kind of go, "Yeah, I might have to tick that box." It's interesting how kind of different standards were applied based on knowledge, and we talk about Operation Paperclip and things like this to get scientists away, which actually targeted the British as much as it did the Soviets. But it you know those moral questions and where does science fit in this and everything else become bigger issues as the war goes on and as the end looks to be in sight in some way.
Yeah, absolutely, and you make a really good point, and I'm sure that the guys listening to this, I know there's a incredible amount of knowledge from people that get involved in these streams will be well aware that there's some really underhand stuff that goes on in the closing months of the Second World War, taking examples such as some of the Gestapo chiefs down in south of France, Klaus Barbie being one that springs to mind, that ends up in American employment with, if you like, a clean slate for a period of time, which is really quite clever when you think about it.
So something that's been asked in chat is how are the Axis not able to subvert the British Bletchley Park decoding units since like 1941? I mean, I'll kick off, but Dan can pick this up. I think there's two things you have to think about with this. Is one is the mindset that allows you to believe that your codes have been broken. If you believe you are the master race, if you believe that you are scientifically superior, you need a culture that allows people to challenge that. And that was always a problem that Germany had throughout the war, partly because it lost so many good minds before the war, frankly because a lot of those minds were Jewish. The other second thing I'd say is that it's worth remembering that it was really a genuinely incredible effort that went into keeping the things, to keeping Enigma, to keeping Ultra secret. There are whole periods where even the Americans are denied access to Ultra in, say, Operation Torch because their commanders on the scene misuse it. So there are elements of various German attacks. I think it's at Kasserine Pass where American commanders on the site, when the German advance gets delayed, they turn round and almost radio the Germans and say, "Where are you? We're waiting for you," which is a very American thing to do. It's very bravado, but that knowledge comes from Ultra, and those generals and those commanders on the scene are immediately cut off from it. Weirdly, one of the best books I've found you can read about this is actually Cryptonomicon by Neil Stevenson. Really captures the mood of how intelligence works. It's a fascinating thing in its own right. But I mean, Dan, what do you think about why were the Germans never ever really to kind of able to go right? Well, to penetrate the Allies in spy terms in the same way as the Allies penetrated the Germans.
I'd very much agree with what you said there. There's an element of it actually just being considered impossible. I mean, these are incredibly complex systems, and let's face it, the invention of a computer effectively is needed to be created in order to help break these codes. And then it really the keys to this is relying on an element of human error. So there's an element of not worrying too much about it. It's possibly a bit like we find with units like SOE and wanting to believe the better outcome, which is incredibly naive, but I'm sure it's into the human psyche as well. But the whole story of sort of subterfuge and espionage and code breaking in the Second World War is so incredibly complex that really I don't think we understand it even today, and I suspect there's quite a considerable amount of information that is still not in the public domain. Will be informing us in another 30 years about actually how the Second World War played out in those terms.
Yeah, and I think we also have to consider that one of the things that happened over in Germany is you've got this difference between, say, the various, let's say, politicized arms of intelligence and the non-politicized. And going into the war, at least, and certainly for a good chunk of it, you've got the Abwehr under the command of William Canaris, and he's frankly an active anti-Nazi. You're always going to be in trouble if the person who's in charge of your intelligence service is an anti-Nazi and you're a Nazi. Canaris is critical in making sure that Spain doesn't enter the war, for example. Canaris eventually dies in captivity, because they work out that he's an anti-Nazi. But there's a non-zero. I've seen things for it. I'm not entirely convinced by it, but I think partly with you, like you say, I think more sources will come to light as to just how much contact Canaris had actually had with the Allies during the course of the war. It's a very different thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of it. I mean, looking at the time period we're at now, 20th of March 1945, it would be naive to think that some major German players and major, in this case, American players weren't in very serious contact. And even the part of Europe we're looking at the moment is effectively settled over a deal not too far in the distant future. That will be through the SS General Karl Wolff meeting, amongst others, Alan Dulles in Switzerland, and working out deals in part to save his own skin. It's got to be said, and he's another one that I think possibly earned himself a trip with the noose. But there were many underhand deals done, and so many that we probably have no idea even took place.
We've Danzig has just fallen. We've just seen the game where East Prussia is really suffering now, and we're moving towards Berlin. Dan, do you want to talk a bit about Königsberg and Danzig and the issues we get for there? He says, eyeing up the fact that you can go and get another beer while you do so because you're way more
Yeah,
expert
sure.
at this than I am.
I'll touch on Danzig briefly because it is a place that I've visited, and I hope some of you guys listening in might consider making a visit. Of course, it's known as Gdansk today, but it's actually the site of the very first shots of the Second World War, and they're fired by a German, I believe it's a cruiser, at a place called the Westerplatte, which is a military base in the Free Polish capital at that time, and it really kicks off the entire Second World War. Real tragedy about Danzig really is it's not treated as a home city when it's captured by the Germans, because it's been in this kind of no man's land during the interwar period, and it's treated incredibly harshly by the Soviets as well when they come back in about this time, as we just see in 1945. It's Army Group North up in this part of Europe at this time, and really they actually get split on at least two occasions by Soviet thrusts up into the Baltic, which cut off a large chunk of Army Group North in both Königsberg and also further up towards Riga, and then again around Danzig. And taking a big chunk out of the German army's order of battle is not a positive thing at this time. There's a couple of attempts to try and bring round refugees from these locations. One most notably is going to be the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a Second World War, a pre-war cruise liner that had been converted and had literally been loaded to the gunwales with soldiers, civilians, and wounded, and was sailing its way around from the North Baltic coast when it was hit by a Soviet submarine. Sunk it, making it by far the worst maritime disaster in history. I think the numbers of casualties were somewhere in the region of 7 or 8,000, and that's just a staggering number in a single incident.
I think it's actually
And
even higher than that. I mean, the last numbers I saw was a new estimate by a German historian, and he put it at about 9,000, 9,500. Because he was
incredible.
talking about how kind of the level of kind of how hard it is to kind of work out how many people are on those ships at the time.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
In a time like that.
it's an incredible time. Someone's just pointed out, Irish Jake's just popped into chat and has mentioned that with no Western Front to speak of, it seems surprising that Germany isn't faring better on the Eastern Front. Um, I think one of the interesting things for me as a historian and a gamer is actually it's really highlighting almost the importance of the Allied victories in the West to the peace, to the world we see as today, to Europe as we see it today. But it's also really highlighting the impact that the Soviets had on the war and just how much of a juggernaut they had become by the end of it. And I think that's something that's really, really noticeable here. We're paused at the moment, so I assume that Mordred's doing some stuff. I will have a quick look on his stream.
It's talking into us here, yeah.
Ah, right. Okay, hang on. Sorry. Let me unmute him for channel. I've got him muted because I figure he doesn't want everyone giving away his ideas. Hang on. Let me unmute you, Mordred. You are now unmuted. Go for it.
Hooray! Hello. I saw that there were only a
going?
few minutes of the stream left, so I thought I'd pop over and say hello.
Yeah, so we've been talking about your successful defence of Western Europe. We're hearing you did some awesome stuff with U-boats. I mean, as someone who has watched you multiple times navally dominate the world, I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah, so the USA and the UK are basically out of the war. They both have less than 100 convoys left, so that they can't do anything.
So we've been talking about how this has really highlighted that kind of, the Soviets are still a bit of a problem.
Yeah. I have noticed that there's a fair number of British troops on the Eastern Front as well. There were a couple earlier anyway. But wow, yeah, the Soviets are really strong. The big issue that I've been facing is just it's a war of attrition. I started with low supply. I started with negative 250,000 guns. I'm still on negative 145,000. I actually increased my economic law from scraping the barrel to all adult serve, which freed up another 30% factory output. And since then, I've actually been kind of fighting back a little bit and stopped the attacks in the north, at least. But it's too little, too late.
So I mean, one of the genuine German strategies throughout, in historically speaking, was that belief that they could force a separate peace on the west to the east. It was this whole thing of if we can hold the Soviets in the east and really make them bleed in the west, then eventually the west will turn around and go, yeah, we'll peace you out, and that would either allow Germany to flip to the east, or essentially force a new alliance against a Soviet thing. It's weirdly interesting that your strategy is almost playing that out.
Yeah, and I suspect it probably would have been true. Like, I would be starving Britain right now because they have so little transport capacity. And I think that would force them to the negotiating table.
I mean, we can confirm. I've clicked through to the Soviets, and I can confirm there's an awful lot of Frenchmen that seem to be going through the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics right now,
Yes.
heading in your direction. I mean, this has been fascinating from our side of things. I'm conscious that the Legion is shortly going to be popping over, so we'll end this stream shortly because the Legion's about to pop over and see the Army esports team. If you're not following us on the Legion game stream, do pop to that afterwards to go and watch it there. What would be your overriding thoughts, Mordred, after doing this? Is kind of, do you have a newfound respect to German generals, or do you now laugh at them and think you could do better?
Well, I would. My overall view of Germany at this situation is they were screwed because the Soviets were so strong. In terms of how the German generals fought, I mean, the ones who held up in Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, Operation Market Garden, all of those guys did a fantastic job. Against the Soviets, I feel like they probably could have done a little bit better holding them up, but ultimately it was a doomed task. I don't think it would have been possible.
So your little oil pocket has disappeared. That's the thing that you kind of did so well to keep hold of, was down in Romania.
Yeah, and it's the oil that allowed the U-boats to keep going.
Yeah, we were kind of sort of, or I was wondering about that at least, is that must have been so vital to kind of them prosecuting your essential naval war.
Yeah, because one thing that I noticed in the later scenario of this, so you can play the Endsieg, which is 1945, basically the fall of Berlin. I lasted a grand total of 4 minutes in that when I tried it, by the way. But the big issue that Germany has in there is they still have an air force, but no oil to power them. So even though I've been annihilated in the skies, it was my air force actually that destroyed the Normandy landings, because they were the ones who killed all the convoys before I got U-boats into insignificant numbers. I actually managed to keep open channels with Venezuela going through the Norwegian Sea and then the Eastern North Sea for quite a long time. So I was getting oil from them, rubber from Indonesia, and from Vietnam until Vietnam fell. But yeah, Soviets, they're just so strong.
Can we basically agree that the real winner out of this war is Finland as well?
Yeah, Finland did phenomenally. I mean, they switched sides at just the right moment. I mean, they've actually come out of this stronger because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing Finland enter the world as a world power in this, in terms of sketch that. Dan, have you got any thoughts or questions for Mordred?
And you know what? It's been really enjoyable just listening in and actually kind of exploring how things could have gone differently. To see how Mordred's really, the truth is, Mordred had presented the same problems that the German army was presented with in 1944, and he's come up with a set of solutions that were actually superior to quite a number of the world's leading military strategists. So big hats off to Mordred for managing to do the job there.
Well, there we go.
I just want to make one quick point, and that is, I think the linchpin for this entire war, the turning point, was the Warsaw Uprising.
Yeah.
When I lost Warsaw and I lost that river crossing, it was over. I have not been able to hold them since.
See, we did watch that quite carefully, because we were like, can he pull off a bit of a pocket here? This is a salient. If he can stop it being a salient, there's a chance. But yeah, it was weird, almost a counter history of the Soviets deciding to reinforce the Warsaw Uprising that was somewhat your undoing.
I mean, it was completely, and it also, at that point, I realized how weak my mechanized units were, because I had Rommel up there, I had Dietrich up there, I had my Normandy reinforcements, like, they're really well led, up there, and all three of those armies could not budge them. Like, as soon as that attack failed, I knew it was over.
So to finish then, in historical terms, are you currently plotting against Hitler?
Yes, definitely. I'm on Dönitz. Well, I know Dönitz was actually the one who took over, but I would be thinking very carefully if I were Dönitz, because I would definitely be like the hero of the German Reich right now, the only successful one to have come out of this.
It's been, as Dan said, to echo Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure watching this. It's always fun watching you stream anyway, and genuinely, everyone who's in chat here from the Legion side, go follow Mordred. Honestly, like, this stuff, Kaiserreich as well. I mean, you guys haven't even seen the world of Kaiserreich yet. Mordred's a big streamer of Kaiserreich, which is sort of all history of kind of World War I/2. It's been enormous fun doing this. Hopefully it's been good. I've been picking in on the chat comments there, and it seems to have been quite fun over there as well. So I'm looking forward to going back and watching the video of this stream later from your perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching your stream as well, because I'm really curious about how the historical context compared to what happened here.
Cool.
So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you also to the British Legion for coming up with the idea in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, this has been brilliant. This has been absolutely great fun, and hopefully we'll do it again at some point. But yeah, we should sign off here and leave you to next stream. Are you carrying on streaming after this with a different game, or is this the end for this evening?
No, I'm going to be taking a break, have some dinner, and then I'll be back again at 10 o'clock this evening to play some more Mount & Blade.
Excellent. Well, I will see you then, and I highly recommend everyone else should if you're into your medieval stuff as well. So, yes. Brilliant. Well, we will... Dan, I think, is there any final comments you want to make before we wrap up?
Do you know, just a quick one from me, and that's to say this has been a completely new experience for me. This is not something that I've had the pleasure to be involved in up until now, and what a really eye-opening experience. And I'm firmly convinced that some really good outlets for history traveling down this path, and it's a big thank you for you guys for getting involved and and taking on what is a fairly new method of delivering history.
Yeah, and I should add that, like, to everyone in chat, thank you so much for watching us as we did this. You guys have helped make it as well. You've kept it moving, you kept the conversation. When me and Dan have kind of, we've been chatting away here, and we've tried to keep an eye on chat, but it's always hard. And when people have asked questions, others have popped in and answered them. That's absolutely brilliant. It's so much loved. I mean, we want to do more of this. If you'd like this, if you want to do more of this, if you want us to do more of this, tweet about it. Copy us in, tweet about it. link into the video, because obviously the video for this will be up on Twitch shortly, so more people can watch it. Share it far and wide. We'd love to have more guests on. There's lots of people we'd love to have on. If you've got a period of history you'd like us to do, or like us to do two or more like this, then we'll do it. You can also follow us on Twitter, as Dan's mentioned before as well. He's a fantastic battlefield guide. I have been in the company of many of them, and Dan is by far my favourite. And I'm not just saying that because he buys me beers occasionally. So yeah, Dan, where can people find you on Twitter?
So I can be found at Dan Hill History, nice and straightforward.
And I will be very much on Twitter. You can find me at Garius. I may also be back online streaming again tomorrow with EU4 for a change, which is if you it's similar grand strategy, but if you like your if you like your kind of Renaissance history, that's where you'll find me there. But yeah, again, thank you so much to everyone who's watched, and we will leave you there. We highly recommend you go back and join the other rest of the Legion stream this evening. I will be going to watch it at least until Mordred's online again. And thanks very much for watching. I will leave you, as we rightfully should do, with the one and only Lily Marlane.